best to support people on the ground in that area who are actually adopting queer identities or lesbian and gay identities, caught between these two kinds of conflicting social forces. Because if they collaborate kind of with the Israeli notion of sexual identity in a certain way, they cut themselves off from their ability to actually engage with the milieu in which they're working. And if they abandon notions of individual sexual orientation and identity in order to fit into that kind of notion, then what they do is to leave themselves vulnerable to all sorts of attacks. Right? So, I mean, if you look at the people in the Queen boat cruise thing that were arrested, I mean, nobody there wanted to come out, right? Now, is that a matter of closetry, or is that a matter of them simply not adopting a subject position as a gay person, right? Is it or is it simply a tactical move that to be open about that subject position puts you in the line of fire, and therefore you don't want to do that, right? Nobody, as far as I know, has actually been able to sit down and talk to those men and try to figure out where they might fit on that continuum, try to make sense of why they were on that boat in the first place, how they understood their arrests, and how they understood their kind of response in terms of fighting back or not fighting back. We can't figure that out. One of the things that I've been toying with to try to understand it, and I don't think it's at all, it hasn't really come to grips, but a friend of mine, Rodney Bobwash, was an Aboriginal elder who did lots and lots of progressive work. And he talked about the kettle, right? And he would start his talk by saying, how did traditional Aboriginal people in this part of the world boil water? You know, it's like something you don't think of. But how would you boil water? Because you didn't have a container, right? You had a clay pot, but you put that on the fire, it would break, right? So to boil water, you'd have to get a skin bag and like grease it up really well and make the, you know, really tight. And you'd put water in it, and then you'd put rocks in the fire until they got as hot as they could, and then you'd drop the rocks in the skin bag and you'd close it up, and that would warm up the water. It would never really boil, but at least you got hotish water. Incredibly labor intensive. It's like, makes life absolutely miserable. And then somebody comes along with a kettle. It's like, it's revolutionary. You put the water in, you put it on the fire, right? You've got a frying pan, right? Suddenly you can fry. And so people's lives were made, women's lives were made, because women tended to do more of that kind of work, just enormously bettered by this introduction of a new technology. At the same time, that technology involved them into international circuits of capital. Because in order to get the kettle, you had to hunt, you had to get the skins, you had to sell the skins to the company, and they would give you the kettle. And when there was such a huge demand for skins, then you depleted the beaver in your area, you had to move into somebody else's area, and then you were engaged in wars with them over territory because you both needed to get, you know, and so this thing kind of domino effect across the country. So if we begin to take Foucault's notion of technology as a self, how people, which is basically how people produce identities, and you suddenly see people who have been getting sex in particular kinds of conditions that did not involve queer or gay identity, suddenly presented with this notion of gay, where you can integrate your sexual life with your emotional life, with your public life. Suddenly all of this stuff becomes possible in ways that before were completely inconceivable. Now, is this a new technology that people are going to grasp onto? And I think you see people grasping onto that in all parts of the world. Obviously, the people who grasp onto it are those people who are in particular kinds of class locations that have more contact with that globalizing world, right? If you're, the peasant working on the land with your hoe and you're not connected at all, that will not probably be a possibility for you. But if you've got access to the internet and you're literate, which has its class, which is a class effect, then suddenly this new technology, this technology itself becomes available to you. But at the same time, it hooks you into these international circuits of capital flow, right? In all sorts of ways, and in labor flow. So, we have Toronto filled with gay refugees, right? People who come here, right? Because once they've adopted this identity, suddenly what's possible for them in the countries where they have grown up becomes intolerable, and they have to move, right? And so, what is the effect of that on those countries, on these countries, right? Are they being duped by this identity? Is the woman who wanted the kettle to boil her water being duped, right? I mean, certainly it's having profound social effects way beyond the boiling of water, way beyond, the getting of sex. But at the same time, it's having these enormous effects on culture, on society, on religion, on family, on tribe, on notions of honor, on all of those kinds of things that have been kind of central to the way people put their lives together.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot there. And it does connect back to what you were saying, some people will make the connection with colonialism. The fact that a lot of these technologies are developed, for example, in the West, and then get shared around the world, and that's a way of viewing it. In places like China, who want to, and do, restrict access to things and censor the internet and stuff. So there's all those elements.
It's also important to take a step back from the particular colonial conjuncture that we're in and also recognize that this notion of pure culture is also a fiction, that there's always been this huge interchange. I mean, we didn't invent gunpowder in Europe, right? Nor did we invent printing press. Right? I mean, all of those things came from elsewhere, agriculture, and there's this kind of a more remarkable book by Jared Diamond, where he talks about the reason that Eurasia developed differently from Africa. And he said Africa or North America, right? They're both north-south continents. So they're divided into agricultural zones. You've got innovation up here in agriculture or the technology surrounding agriculture. You can't move it north and south because different crops grow, different things pertain, right? Whereas in the Eurasian continent, which is an east-west thing, you've got similar kinds of agricultural zones from China right across to Europe. Right? So an innovation here suddenly is useful right across, and an innovation there is useful back. And so you get this kind of synergies building up, and development focus is certainly shifting from east to west, but always along that corridor. Right? That isn't possible in North America. The agriculture that's developed by the Aztecs can't be used in Peru. Right? And potatoes don't grow so well in Mexico, right? Corn is better there. So that the kinds of cultural sharings are also geographically determined. Now, in the globalized world, geography is overcome, and suddenly these cultural sharings spread everywhere. And they spread under particular power conditions where certain groups who control the technology use them and use their introduction to exploit and pillage parts of the world that haven't developed them indigenously. And if you begin to try to think of identities as a technology of self that's part and parcel of that sudden sharing, okay, so what kind of politics do we do around this?
Yeah, some interesting stuff there, a lot to think about. I'm going to move us on to how you would define your role in the crew.
I guess I've often found myself in a leadership role of one sort or another, for a number of different reasons. I mean, I come from a relatively privileged strata, so that, you know, I was born here, received a decent education, speak English as a first language, never had trouble getting employment of one sort or another. I mean, I never risen to the top of the corporate ladder, nor did I have those kinds of desires. But what it meant was that the material conditions of my life meant that I could always give a substantial part of my time and energies to movement building and political activities. And so for those reasons, and the fact that, you know, I didn't die like a whole lot of other people in the AIDS period, have given me a history and a series of experience that I've been able to build on, and that have been useful as one kind of struggle or one kind of social situation transformed itself into another. So, you know, at times it's been kind of reluctant, because, you know, I do the media work and the profile work, and sort of don't do too bad a job of it, but it's not something, you know, if anybody else wants to do it, you know, it's not something that I crave, right? I joke about being a media slut, but, you know, there's a bit of an adrenaline rush from that kind of thing, but, you know, I would far prefer to be home sometimes just reading a book. Right? But, you know, these things sort of come on you, and I mean, the QuaIA thing, for example, I think is a perfect example. Because I've always held what I consider a progressive position around Middle Eastern politics, but I've never knew too much about it. It was always kind of from a bit of a distance. And when they asked me in 2009 to talk about the Simon Coady Anti-Apartheid Committee and its relationship, you know, I thought it was going to be, you know, half an hour talk, right? That was going to be it. And then all of the shit started hitting the fan. Not so much aimed at me, but aimed at El Farouk, right? Because, you know, somebody with a Muslim name is a much more vulnerable target, and so they went after him, and the racism was just palpable, right? And so, you know, you can't just sort of walk out of that kind of a fight. And so I found myself, you know, going to the next meetings and trying to figure out where to go from there, and dealing with all this pride stuff, because a lot of the people in QuaIA coming from that more younger queer ambiance didn't really have much of a stake in pride or understand kind of the politics that was going on there. I mean, it wasn't kind of as intimate to them as somebody like me who, you know, been around since the very first Pride, and right, sort of understood how it worked and all of those kinds of things. So I found myself having a kind of a role there, sometimes almost reluctantly, because of that experience that I brought, having not died.
And given that you had this longevity, you've been around from the very early parts of the movement right through to the present, and been active throughout, how is, again this term, but how is queer liberation expressed in your activism?
Well, I guess there's always been that kind of contrariness aspect of the queer stuff, right? Because even though these are now seen as kind of great moments in gay liberation, the struggles that we were going forward with them at the time were often not popular or palatable even. You know, when I'm organizing the Body Politic Freedom Press Fund around men loving boys loving men, right? This is like, a lot of people, you think, you know, these bloody troublemakers, right? I mean, we're making a little bit of progress, and now look what they're doing, right? And when the bath raids happened, right? I mean, men fucking baths all together, this is not kind of the squeaky clean, nice picket fence notion of what a normal queer person should be to be accepted by their straight neighbors, right? I mean, it was kind of very in your face, and the anti-apartheid stuff as well was, it was edgy. I mean, the government of Canada at that point was in constructive engagement, right? These people who wanted to boycott South African products were seen as being kind of anti-liberal and way too radical. And then even in LGBT communities, it wasn't lost on people that really the only country in the African continent that had any kind of a gay liberation or a gay rights movement was South Africa, right? And here we are attacking the system that allowed this to be produced, right? I mean, what are you doing, right? Why don't you go live in Botswana and see how it was like to be gay there, right? The arguments that you hear, like, have been recycled, right? That's quite interesting. And then AIDS stuff, right? Once again, dealing with dying and disease and promiscuous sex and all this kind of stuff. So all of these struggles that, through the lens of history, seem so heroic and important at the time, were edgy, very, very edgy. And I think that one of the things about this notion of queer is that edginess. It's not struggling to become normalized, even though becoming normalized is often the effect, but that it takes on those issues that other people find a little bit too hot to handle.
A thought that goes through my mind in some of your comments, just this recent one and the other ones, is it's almost as if the work of liberationism that we call queer, or even on broader sexual liberation or even beyond that, is always incomplete.
Well, it's incomplete because it's contradictory, because as soon as you win, then it's normal, right? As soon as, gay papers are okay, then it's normal, and nobody, if extra is not put in a public library, that's considered a bit of a scandal, and it gets fixed, right? Whereas, the body politic in a public library, so like you win that fight, and then it becomes normal, and it's not edgy anymore, right? Just the way that bathhouses are not particularly edgy anymore, like they're now licensed by the city, and they know exactly what's going on, and they're used for safer sex education, and public health comes in, and does all this kind of stuff, and they're all part of the apparatus, right? And AIDS, right? And AIDS is now, you wear your red ribbon at the Academy Awards, and it's no longer this disease that you have to shun, and that everybody has to run from, right? It can become normalized, and so then, at that point, it's no longer queer. It's normal.
And this kind of leads to the next question, and that is, can you distinguish queer liberation, or again, if you want to use a different term, from other theories or perspectives, and if so, in what ways?
I don't think there's a coherent queer liberation theory, right? So I don't know how you see these different kinds of movements where things turn into other things, and things turn into their opposites, and one of the real weaknesses of queer liberation in terms of theory is that it is ungrounded, in my point of view. It doesn't even gesture towards a material base. So if you look at Fora's book on terrorist assemblages, which introduced this idea of homo-nationalism, which I think is quite a useful and interesting concept. There's really no attempt at looking at the connections between that kind of political position and the enormous class disparities that have been generated by neoliberalism. Right? And there are two things that are happening, right? One is the success of the rights perspective, which have meant that simply being gay or lesbian is no longer an impediment to citizenship the way it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago when it was legal. But there's also, when that movement began, the fact that in the 70s, for example, there weren't the kind of class distinctions within the community that there are now. If you ever look at the stats around Toronto in 1970, 66% of people in Toronto lived in neighborhoods which were quote-unquote middle class, middle income. And there was like 20% that were well above and like something like 20% below, right? Whereas now in Toronto, there's something like 25% of people in Toronto live in middle income districts. And 50% of the population is below the average. And then you got that 20 that's just much, much richer than before and much more isolated than before. You got a cross-class movement like, because we are everywhere, we're born in all those kind of class positions. How could you not expect differences in politics between the 20% who are at the top of their game and whose sexual orientation is no longer an impediment to their enjoying their privileges, and those people, 50% of the population, who are trying to work 2 jobs because they're minimum wage jobs and they're getting laid off and they don't have any benefits or any of those kinds of things, and their lives are constantly in turmoil and falling apart. I mean, how could you not expect hugely different political orientations from one end of that spectrum to another? In 1970s, there were rich people around and there were poor people, but everybody was able to afford going to a bar and having a drink. Most people could afford could go to a bathhouse, right? I mean, it wasn't that expensive. But if you're having to go to the fucking food bank, pay $20 to go to a bath, I mean, that shoots your budget, right? And so you're seeing these kinds of social differences developing within the community and people's notion of their identity and what that means, and the kinds of resentments back and forth, kinds of fears back and forth. And all this stuff that happened around Pride, I think if you actually look at it, I mean, QuaIA was kind of like the spark that, the match that somebody dropped into the gas tank, but, it was already an inflammable situation. I mean, why is it that Blockorama kept getting shifted around so much? Well, black people are not a niche market, right? They're not considered important. They don't have a lot of money to give to Bank of Montreal, right? If you look at the way that racialization and class disparity have gone hand in hand, right? So, I mean, of course they're a second thought, right? Because they're not who your sponsors are really interested in, right? And you can say, people say, well, it's racist. Well, it is racist, but people got to remember that ideas are far less important in affecting people's practices than practices are in affecting people's ideas. Right? And so that the fact that Blockorama gets moved around is on the one hand racist, but on the other hand, it's not that people are motivated by racism, they don't like black people, so they just don't care about them. Because they're not on this radar, right? They're not the neoliberal subject, right? Because most black people are much poorer in Toronto than they were 25 years ago. Right?
Okay. We're going to go into some of the themes now, and dealing with history, a question you chose was, did the gay liberation movement borrow from other movements? And if so, which movements and how?
Yeah, that early gay liberation movement, and even when it shifted into kind of a gay rights movement, I think, was very much a product of its time. So, I mean, the term liberation had to do with the term liberation that was happening all around the world, largely national liberation, because it was the end of the collapse of that European colonial empire, the actual legal control, not economic control, mind you, but the legal control of its colonies. And so there were national liberation struggles happening all over the place, and this notion that you could become politically involved and fight the power and affect the way the state was organized, and that everybody's life would get a whole lot better. I mean, it was kind of fundamental to that whole period. So you had national liberation in kind of the anti-colonial struggles. You had black liberation struggles happening as a much more radical form of the civil rights movement. You had women's liberation as well. So it was only logical that these new gay subjects, individual gay subjects, would see the example of people, as counterintuitive as it might be, banding together, forming community, right, as individuals forming community, in order to be able to affect the way the state was operating and the way society was operating. So that early movement, I think, drew all of its theoretical formulations from those struggles that were taking place elsewhere. And in the shift towards gay rights, I mean, that I think then was kind of modeled on the civil rights struggle, which had become much more mainstream, but also was showing at that point certain effects. So it seemed to be the civil rights struggle was working. People got the vote, right? They began to, black people in the southern states got the vote. Women's position in society was changed. It became illegal to pay women less for doing the same kind of work as a man, right? So that was all seen as being useful and practical to people's lives. And I think that part of that shift from gay liberation to gay rights that also had to do with what happened to, say, black liberation. So the Panthers, for example, simply were wiped out. They were physically annihilated, right? They were shot, they were murdered, or they were sent to prison. And so that kind of much more edgy liberation kind of talk, especially with the ending of the anti-colonial liberation movements, usually by their quote-unquote success, which then usually found them kind of trapped in a kind of a neo-colonial relationship rather than a colonial one. I think people began to think, well, that stream of thought isn't going anywhere, right? You look what happens to them, right? I mean, it just doesn't work. And so civil rights is a much more practical way of organizing people. And once again, masses made history. That's where people got involved. That's where they voted with their feet. And that probably had to do with the class composition of gay communities and who managed to dominate it and all those kinds of questions as well. Even given the fact that the class disparities were not nearly as great as they are today. So, yeah, I think that our movement owes its existence not only, it owes its existence to the kind of social changes that began to produce networks and networks that began to produce identities, but it also had to do with the kinds of politics of social change that were happening in all other aspects in that period of the late 60s, mid-70s, until neoliberalism actually began to exert itself much more strongly in the early 80s.
Okay, so I'll just put up the next question so you can give us some thought that you chose, and that's also under history. What does queer liberationism have to say about progress, time, and modernity? That's okay. Yeah. So
Yeah.
just hold that. Okay, so I'll repeat that again. Also under history, what does queer liberationism have to say about progress, time, and modernity?
Well, I think that, I mean, progress, time, and modernity, when posed against queer liberation, actually reveal the dissonance in the term queer liberation, because the queer part would say there is no progress, and I don't know what it would actually say about time, but they would say modernity is an illusion, and that more than that, it's probably an oppressive illusion, colonialist one, an imperialist one. Whereas the liberation part would say that progress is something that we have to struggle for and build, and that time is linear, and our efforts continue to produce progress through that linear progression of time, and modernity is in fact the final goal of progress, and that once modernity is reached in the world, that the progress and modernity go together, and that modernity gives us the possibility of a more egalitarian, a more open, a more tolerant, a more liberal society. So what queer liberation would say about that, I don't know, because I mean, those terms are the terms that queer and liberation theory contest, right? Their take on what those terms mean is the battleground between those two schools of thought, I think. Queer liberation, as you define it in a more sort of within the modernist narrative, I guess, would say that progress is possible, if not inevitable. I think it would still adopt the linear notion of time of the modernist novel, and it would critique modernity more, but attempt to build on particular elements of it.
Great. And moving to the theme of dissension, there's this question you chose: are dissident voices threatening? It's a two-parter. Do you consider queer liberationism radical?
Dissident voices are always threatening to somebody, right? Otherwise they wouldn't be dissident, right? I mean, it's quite clear that QuaIA's contingent marching with some unpopular slogans in the Pride Parade threatened a whole lot of people, right? Now, on the other hand, I think that there's a whole political strategy behind amplifying that threat, right? So that I think that we were probably far less threatening than we were made out to be. But the notion of community, which papers over class and race and all of those other kinds of distinctions, which also so importantly organize the way people live their lives and therefore understand themselves in the world. Whenever dissident voices begin to emerge within community, then of course community is revealed as a kind of an imaginary construction, because it shows the divisions. It shows that we don't all think the same thing and live the same way and have the same values. And so I think that it's not only those people who I think it's mostly the privileged sectors of the community that find them most threatening, both because it threatens or it connects unpopular things with struggle to be normative and integrated, but also because they recognize to a certain extent that they have become normal and integrated because of the power that communities wield, and fear that any kind of dissension within that community reveals the community not to be a coherent political force, and therefore in a certain way potentially threatens some of the gains that they've tried to make.
And what about this notion of radicalism? I'm connecting it here to the question of
Yeah.
liberation and dissension. It's kind of
Radicalism is this notion of getting to the roots of things, but the radical tradition has usually been about, I would say, not getting to the... this radical tradition finds itself opposed to a Marxist tradition, for example. The Marxist tradition actually begins to sees class as the root of a whole lot of other things. Whereas what passes for radicalism is in fact usually a radical liberalism, one that sees its goal as uncompromising formal equality. And there's something to be said for uncompromising formal equality, but other kinds of more social analyses, I think, point out that formal equality is not the be-all and end-all. There's a famous quip from Marx to say that the capitalist is free to hire and fire labor, and labor is free to work or starve. Right? They both got formal equality. Doesn't grasp other fundamental things that are going on.
Okay. And okay, there we go. So you also have a second question, which is also a two-parter under dissension, and that is, what is at stake? Is it important to be visibly queer, to be in open dissension of normalizing techniques, tactics, and if so, why?
I think it would depend on the context. I think that maybe one of my critiques of queer theory is that it really fetishizes being on the outside. And if people are really disadvantaged from being on the outside, most people on the outside would like to get in a little bit more. Thanks, right? And that's why there's this move to try to do some politics. Because I think that fetishization without a social analysis then is kind of patronizing, and in fact most of the people who are making the analysis are not on the outside so much themselves at all, even though they like to pose that way. I remember getting into this argument with somebody at the AIDS conference here in Toronto, and they were doing they were looking at popular education and AIDS stuff, and there was a study in China where they were training AIDS educators, but the population was illiterate. And so all these clever schemes to do it with pictures and things like that, right? And so the question that I asked was, given that, take the work of Paulo Freire, for example, but there's been like years and years of using literacy as popular education, right? Using the stuff that people really need to learn and showing them teaching them how to read and write at the same time, because those are enormously powerful tools in terms of their continuing education and their beginning to connect with other people and all of those kinds of things. And so nobody was talking about that kind of work. They were all talking about getting around the fact that these people were illiterate rather than dealing with the fact that they were illiterate, right? And so I asked this question. There was this guy from Brazil who was doing this kind of web-based education stuff, and who said, this talk about empowering people around literacy. He doesn't believe in that because as soon as you empower people, then you've changed them and they're no longer authentic. And I thought, what the fuck, you know? He's here talking in English. He's doing a website in Portuguese and Spanish, right? He comes from a privileged background and he's opposing teaching poor people to read and write because empowering them will make them less fucking authentic. I mean, give me a break, right? So that's kind of fetishizing of, you know, being the other, the authentic other, I think is a real problem, and one would try not to do that. So, but there are other points when, I mean, if we're talking about homo-nationalism, when people have become so normalized that they see their allegiance to their particular nation or their state formation, and that, you know, wanting to join the army so you can, you know, we can go kill people in Afghanistan too, right? You know, that kind of stuff, I think, really needs a critique, and you need people on the outside saying, hold it, you know, is that the kind of liberation that we want? Is that, you know, is that what we're gaining for? And so you get, once again, this kind of very contradictory situation where you should have the right to serve in the armed forces, but do you want to serve in the armed forces? So one of those complicated questions about not fetishizing being on the outside, but not fetishizing being on the inside either.
Okay. Good. We're going to move on to another theme here where you were touching on this a little bit earlier, and that's rights-based claims and troubling equality.
Yeah.
And so you've chosen to address the issue of what is the difference between equality and equity?
The definition that we always used in the Board of Education, and, you know, both, I guess, which fit within the same kind of normalization narrative in a certain way, was that equality was treating everybody the same. Equity was treating people, giving people what they needed in order to be able to succeed. And recognizing that what people needed was going to be really, really different depending on who they were. So that simply treating people the same could in fact be a way of reproducing inequality. And if we're trying to struggle for equality, then we need to use equity as a way of doing that. Now the problem that you get down to with that definition within an organizational context is how do you measure success? Right? And it was, I suppose, not completely unethical in the board situation to say, well, we measure success by graduation. You know, if 40% of one group is dropping out and only 10% of another group is dropping out, and the only difference is the color in their skin, right? Like, you know, we're doing something wrong. And until we have equality, so that the same number of kids drop out no matter what their gender or their skin color or then we haven't succeeded. But then that gets problematic as well, because is the goal of equity to produce an unequal class structure? You know, if we can judge our success by those kinds of rates, so that if you looked at the social pyramid, there were the same percentage of black people at the top and the middle and in the very bottom being absolutely desperate, have we succeeded? Or is the problem that there are some people who are doing very, very well and other people who are very, very desperate, right? Is that not a different kind of problem? Don't we need to change the shape of this triangle, right? And so that was always the tension within that kind of equity work. And it would often be expressed in different ways in terms of race stuff. You know, are we demanding that, you know, kids of color become white and act like and succeed like white kids, right? Is that our standard of success, or are there different standards of success? but you get into there as well, then that can once again begin to fetishize the kind of being on the outside. So that yes, you're a really successful pimp, right? But is that a good idea, right? How do you begin to judge those kinds of things? Recognizing that people may have different kinds of cultural aspirations, but at the same time seeing how those cultural aspirations can be and are shaped by the kinds of possibilities that are available to them given kind of hierarchical society that we have, and one that is not even on its own liberal terms working properly. Because if you look at that social pyramid, you don't find equality around gender or on anything, right? The upper groups are shifted towards the whiter you are, the more male you are, all of those kinds of things. And then when you have a kind of troubled identity category such as queer, like what does that mean? Like what would clear liberation mean? The people with lots of nose rings ran big corporations, right? I mean, I don't know what that means, right? Are you looking for equality under those terms? Or are you looking to say, well, maybe corporations should be organized quite differently so that nobody runs them the way that they're being run?
And I'm going to go off script here for a minute, and part of the basis for this whole theme, this whole category is the notion of distinguishing those who align themselves with the liberationist perspective versus the very normative, middle-streaming, neoliberal, gay perspective. And this might be simplified, but that align themselves more with reaching equality, with being accepted and respected by the heteronormative kind of picture. Is it fair to say that liberationism isn't all that committed to that per se, or that the ongoing and harder work is beyond equality and part of distinguishing liberationism and the celebration of diversity is to recognize that equity needs to be put in place, and that's a larger project.
I guess. The Liberation Project itself, if it is to be really coherent and to be more than just a liberalizing project, and the Liberation Project, if you look at its history, has always it's been really hard to pull those kinds of things apart, because the Liberation Project is in part actually in reality achieving those liberal goals, right? And surpassing them, right? Yet we live in a society where those liberal goals are not by any means even achieved, even by their own standards. So it's like when you talk about democracy, right? We have in our society democracy in a particular restricted sphere called the political. And in that political sphere, once again within context of citizenship and stuff like that, you have one person, one vote. However, in terms of other equally important parts of society, the economy, for example, we don't have democracy. We have a society where it is $1, one vote, and those dollars are not distributed equally by any means. And so that the economic decisions that affect the lives of people just as intimately and directly, and perhaps even more so as political decisions that are being made in Parliament, are being made entirely outside of any kind of democratic control. If I'm the CEO, I decide right? What am I serving? I'm serving the shareholders, right? I'm not serving the public. So the liberation project, I think, needs, in its essence, if it's to be really true to itself, it has to extend liberation to all aspects of social functioning. Not only to all groups as identity categories, but to the way society actually works. So you actually have, quote unquote, social democracy, right? Society is actually democratically controlled in all of its aspects. So in a certain way that the Liberation Project then inclines to or gestures towards moving beyond identity, because it can't be just for this or that identity group. As soon as you begin to really focus on this or that identity group, then there's a huge tendency for one measuring success by the relative equality or inequality of that identity group. But I'm a queer liberation or any black liberation or any liberation group. But on the other hand, that we have seen that when we move to a general model of liberation that tries to move beyond the particularities of those groups, then we end up reproducing the inequalities between those groups as well, because hegemonic voices always control the narrative. So we're, to a certain extent, if I've been complaining about the problems around the notion of queer liberation and kind of the disjuncture between those two things, even identity liberations run into their own contradictions at a certain point. Because how do you liberate one group if other groups are not liberated? And that's, I think, especially true in terms of a queer community which is by nature intersectional. That with other groups where things like class and race or class and ethnicity those lines become the same, like they become caste-like in terms of like the Indian situation. You can see how affirmative action for a particular caste actually begins to reshape a class structure. But in a queer community where we're everywhere, right, I think that our liberation is completely bound up with that more general notion of liberation. We are in a kind of a, not completely unique, but quite unique situation here, because there's really no other group that spans all classes and all races and all cultures, even though here I'm getting into on thin ice, because if we're talking about identities being socially constructed, then do these identities really span all cultures and all classes? Right? Certainly they do in the Western influenced world or in the liberal influenced world. And then you get into the big debate about social construction versus, I'm blanking on the other word. Come on, who am I?
Class structure.
No, social construction, the big debate, and there's essentialism, right? Essentialism, yeah. You get into the big debate about social constructionism versus essentialism. Is there something, despite the different cultural expressions, is there something quintessentially what we could call gay everywhere, social constructionist model would say, well, no, these identities are completely social constructed, and they're not everywhere. And if you abide by that, then you have to look at kind of not only cultural differences, but class and gender differences in terms of where identities get produced in the real world.
And also, as we were talking before, also depending what context you're looking at it from, right? It's a local context versus say a global context.
A global
Right?
context.
So it's, yeah. I think you're actually moving into the next theme, which is intersectionality. Oh my God, this has gone a bit long. Okay, thank you. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, yeah.
Just complete this? Okay, so we are down to the last question now.
Yeah.
That is under intersectionality. What do you think of identity politics? And in brackets we have here advantages, disadvantages.
Well, I mean, the new stuff is no longer intersectionality; it's assemblages, right? Look at QuAIA stuff. There's this critique of intersectionality that it attempts to look at identity from different directions, but it still privileges notions of individual compartments and sort of like it's where they meet. And I don't know if QuAIA's idea of assemblages actually goes beyond that much or not. I can't understand it because it's so badly written. I mean, identity formations have been tactically advantageous in terms of rights struggles, right? Because identity formations give you critical masses of people who will work together because they feel that they have something in common and who can develop coherent and shared political goals. So identity formations are really good at that. They're problematic to the extent that usually the hegemonic force within the identity formation, especially around queer identity formations, becomes dominant. And then the needs of people who, because of their class or their race or their gender, are not seen as that kind of hegemonic force within the formation. Their needs always come second or third or fourth or not at all. So that there's real contradictions within identity formations because they really don't capture the complexity of this liberal subject position, right? Because you're the individual, but you're also connected to society in all of these. You're only an individual in so much as you're connected to society in all of these different ways. So that expresses itself, that difficulty expresses itself in the fact that some people, now that they've got marriage, think that it's all over, we've won, all we need to do is celebrate, whereas other people are still suffering and think, we're not quite there yet, right? Now, if their particular needs are met, would they think they're quite there? Would they become the hegemonic faction? What happens to others? Until you actually begin to embark on that more global vision of liberation and what that takes, what it would mean to be a egalitarian democratic society in all aspects of social function. So I think that Peter and I were talking about strategic essentialism or strategic identities, right? That even though we know that these identities are social formations and are inventions, but the fact that people feel them intimately and deeply means that they can be strategically useful in terms of mobilizing people for particular kinds of social change. And we have learned that society doesn't. That social change is it's practical work, right? It's not theoretical work. Like the old stuff that they used to say, well, women's liberation will be dealt with after the revolution, right? I mean, it doesn't work that way. That if people don't organize around their particular identities within that process of social change, then they end up getting left out. And so identity is identity is one of those contingent things, something we have to use, but something that we have to at the same time constantly keep our eye on, because it, like history itself, will always sneak up behind you and bite you in the butt.
Okay, great. last theme is today and tomorrow, and you've chosen to address the question of what has been the most revolutionary new idea / theory that you see as important to our queer liberationist movement?
I guess what I was thinking of was the notion of homonationalism and maybe the notion of queer international. Both of which, though, I think have been really poorly understood and theorized because they've come out of an academia which is really cut off from popular struggles and cut off from a materialist analysis of popular struggles. So that when Poor talks about homonationalism, I think I mentioned before, she never links that to kind of class disparities, but also the ideological formations of neoliberalism and kind of the notion of the individual as opposed to the notion of the community. And when Assad talks about the Gay International, he ends up essentializing sexualities in outside of the West in a way that does not account for the way those identities have been, in fact, embraced by people in those evolving countries. So I think that those are the two theoretical formations that we really need to be spending time interrogating and deepening and making sense of and critiquing, because they are the first attempts at being able to understand what is going on in a much more globalized world, in a globalized world which is seeing in fact the decline of traditional Western imperialisms and colonialisms, at the same time as it's seeing kind of last-minute attempts to shore up those power relationships with ever greater resort to military terror and power. I think that, we, as a movement, we've got to recognize ourselves now as some sort of a global movement, and that's problematized by the fact that we don't all share the same identities, and that there are social forces taking shape that are they're kind of like tectonic, that are going to affect what happens to us and our identities and the sexual freedoms that we've managed to achieve here, and community power that we've managed to achieve here in ways that are really quite unprecedented and I think unpredictable. In the way that I was thinking about it, I mean, if people get into that old kind of basin superstructure stuff, which is like very, very crude, but if you think of oceans with tectonic plates underneath them, like when those tectonic plates are relatively quiet, the movements of the oceans have to do with where the sun is and where it's warm and where it's cool, and affects the winds blowing and the moon and the tides and stuff. But when those tectonic plates shift underneath rapidly, as I think we're seeing now, then you get tsunamis, right, which are a different kind of phenomenon. And I think that we as queer people have benefited from a long period of stability in those tectonic plates. We've managed to grow a movement in the concrete privileged part of the world, and no notions of individualism and having time to do volunteer work, and all of those kinds of things. But now we're seeing the end of that period of stability, and how one actually continues to struggle in any kind of progressive way, given those broader and abrupt changes that are beginning to take place in the world in this period of tsunamis. That's beyond my comprehension at this point.
What do you see those forces as being? Is it a repercussion of the growingness that has happened in communities, or like a rebound from?
No, by tectonic plates, I mean, for example, when I was 19, I hitchhiked to India. And I could hitchhike from India, from Europe to India. I needed to flight over the Atlantic, but then the whole world I could move around in. As a single young white man with a Canadian passport, I had no problem around mobility because the world was frozen in that Cold War stalemate, right? I couldn't make that voyage today because most of those countries that I blissfully floated through are either ripping themselves apart in some sort of civil war or under incredibly repressive regimes or have completely collapsed, right? So what we're seeing now, we have grown up in a period where European and American imperialism and colonialism have dominated the world and have managed to produce a hegemonic notion of individual rights and human rights and all of those kinds of things. But now we see the end of that period coming to a place. I mean, the decolonialization happened, then there was the pushback around neocolonialism, but now, I mean, the only thing that stands between the United States and the Bolivian is its army, right? I mean, they are losing the economic war everywhere, and we're seeing new capitalist models emerging, specifically around India, around China, which is a much more authoritarian model. One might argue that the economic imperatives of a complex capitalist society push for more liberalism, but I think that may be a bit of an illusion, simply because the models that have predominated have been more liberal in the past. We have all sorts of other models of totalitarian capitalisms that manage to work fairly well. And so what will it mean in a world where the hegemonic values of liberal individualism are no longer hegemonic, right? What identities will people take up to serve themselves in those very different kinds of environments? Will they look anything like the identities that we've developed? We can't tell, right? But we're reaching a period now where the international power relationships, international economics, international politics is changing in a way that is enormously unpredictable and also unprecedented in my term, my span on the planet. I mean, we've already seen the collapse of the socialist bloc, and now we're seeing the collapse of the European colonial bloc, and we have no idea what the hell is going to replace that. None whatsoever, right? And so then here we are in this, having developed our liberation movement or our rights movement or our communities or whatever you want to call it, within this period of stability within the American and European colonialist bloc, largely, and to a second extent in areas that have been controlled or dominated by them, and then thirdly in areas that have had to do with the global hegemony and those kinds of ideas. But what does that mean when that whole edifice collapses? Where does that leave us? Right? What does our organizing look like if our our economy completely collapses. You know, and lots more sex work, right? Right, because no other jobs are available. Right? And what does it mean to even do it in a society that's? I mean, suppose neoliberalism tends to hang on for another 3 or 4 generations, increasing the social disparities. It first struck me when I went to Nicaragua just after the revolution in '79. You know, there's mostly a male thing, but lots of men having sex, right? But there was no gay movement and precious little gay identity. And I remember going to a party with people, there were no bars because there was no critical mass, right? Either people were too poor or too rich to go to the same bar, so like you couldn't have a gay bar, right? So gay people would get together in house parties. Who had houses? Well, rich people had houses. And who would come to these parties? Young soldiers, young people from the barrios, lower middle class young people who, you know, needed a place to party because they couldn't do it in the shacks where they lived, or the barracks where they lived, right? And then it became this, how would you create a community out of that? It was almost akin to Johns and clients, right? I mean, it wasn't completely gay for pay, but, you know, very close, right? And when the rich people wanted to have a real gay old time, they just fly out to Miami and do it, right? So they might be part of that international gay identity. But the rest of these people, you know, didn't have the capacity. I mean, they didn't have the social possibilities of beginning to identify themselves that way. They'd still go off and get married and do all the things that they had to do in order to live their lives in the barrio or in the barracks or wherever they lived, right? And so in that kind of situation, and you didn't have either the infrastructure in terms of, like, what we see up and down Church Street here with, you know, restaurants and bars and bars and all those kinds of things that are actual meeting places that produce the social networks, that produce the communities. That didn't have an economic basis to survive. And so the identities that would arise out of those social networks also didn't have the potential to arise. And in those days, as before the internet, I mean, unless you were those privileged people that could fly to Miami, you wouldn't even know about life elsewhere, except maybe things that you'd heard, right? I mean, but you couldn't be very sure about how true they were. So, you know, maybe you went out to the park every now and then and risked getting beaten up to get your cock sucked. Right? And then you went on with your life. And your identity was as a worker, as a peasant, as a soldier, you know, as a particular member of a particular family, as somebody from the East Coast or the West Coast or the mountains, or, you know, and those are your identities. Your sexual orientation didn't really enter into it. It might be something that would take you here and there that other people didn't do, but it was all pretty much on the down low. So how are you going to build a movement there under those kinds of social conditions? And we ran the Body Politic because we used to have unemployment insurance. That's how the Body Politic survived. People cycled off and on. I mean, you couldn't produce that kind of paper regularly without some people being there most of the time, and that meant they had to be able to eat, but the paper wasn't able to pay people decent salaries, and so people would work their quota, and then they'd apply for UIC, and they'd get their UIC and continue to work, and then when they ran out for benefits, then they'd go on the paid staff, and somebody else would cycle off. Right? Like, you don't have a social safety net. Like today, we couldn't run a paper like that because the unemployment insurance doesn't work anymore, right? So, you know, the kind of the material reality for producing that paper for 15 years no longer exists. It has to be for profit. Therefore, you have to produce stuff that get advertising out to people, and then what does that do to the kind of copy that you write? Right? It begins to slowly transform that. So, I can't remember the original question about the future, but given the kinds of changes that are taking place, given the decline of empire and the shift of global power, I don't know what it's absolutely.
And just for a second, I'm going to go back to the two theories you were talking about. Do each of them make any kind of connection to liberationist notions?
The two theories, which two?
You talked homo nationalism,
Yeah.
and the other was
The other was Mossad stuff. No, they don't make. Well, yes, I guess they do in a certain way, because what Mossad would say would be that this, what he calls the gay international, this kind of gay human rights stuff that is always, finding homophobia in developing countries and condemning them because they're so backward and not liberal and tolerant enough. Right? That in fact is a kind of colonial version of the liberationist agenda. That there are these gay people out there, that they need to be protected, that they need to be saved, and that we in the West get to liberate them. Right? So it's a riff on the liberation agenda, but through the lens of kind of colonial power relationships. In terms of the idea of homo nationalism, I think she would say that was evidence of the end of a liberation project. That what that means is that, what homo nationalism means is that the hegemonic sectors of this quote-unquote gay community have now got what they need in order to be able to exercise full and equal citizenship, and the rest be damned, right? And so she would say that the liberation movement that shifted into the rights movement has now achieved what it needed for those people who don't experience other indices of oppression and marginalization and exclusion, and therefore it's over as a movement. And so what you see is these people identifying with their national projects. So let's join the army in invading Afghanistan, or I think probably the best example is Israel, right, where you see a very kind of the Israeli LGBTQ movement is very much integrated into the Israeli state apparatus, and there are certainly focuses of opposition, but by and large don't have any kind of critique of colonialism or racism in that society, and are quite happy to celebrate what a wonderful place this is as part of the national project. Israel is kind of I think is one example, but it's maybe a more extreme or visible example, but qualitatively no different from, I think, what's happening in the United States or Canada, or even in parts of, the Netherlands, for example, where you have these kind of neo-fascists, gay people, right, and who can now lead neo-fascist parties, right, that for equality. Gays can be fascists like anybody else, right? I mean, there's equality for you. This is what homo nationalism is leading us to, is the kind of national formation shift more and more to the right and become more and more authoritarian in this period of declining empire. Then certain sectors of the gay community that have achieved their formal equality shift right along with them.
Okay. Well, this takes us to the very last question, if you choose to answer that, is given the questions asked and the discussion we just had, are there any further comments with us you'd like to share before we end the interview?
No, I think I'm kind of exhausted at this point. I can't remember what I said, so I don't know what I might have missed at this point. You give me a transcript, I could.
Thank you so much.
Oh, pleasure.
That was really quite comprehensive and in-depth.
Yeah.
We appreciate that, and including the critiques too. That's important to us as well. Yeah. Interesting stuff.
Interesting times. I'm Tim McCaskell, and these days I often introduce myself as a gay dinosaur. I've been an activist for as long as most people can remember, mostly in the queer community, gay community here in Toronto.
Okay. And going from that, can you tell us a bit about your work and how it addresses queer liberation?
Yeah, we're going to have to talk about what queer liberation means, because I think
Sure.
the term itself is a bit problematic, right?
Okay.
But when I came out in '74, I ended up gravitating to the Body Politic, and I was on the Body Politic Collective for 12 years, I guess. In the early 80s, I chaired the Public Action Committee of the Right to Privacy Committee after the Bath raids. After that, I was quite involved in the Simon Coady Anti-Apartheid Committee, doing anti-apartheid work in queer communities, or gay communities, as they were called then, lesbian gay communities. Then I was one of the founding members of AIDS Action Now, and presently do most of my activist work with Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. But I've also been involved in education work around queer issues, but equity issues in general. So did anti-homophobia, anti-racism, work against sexual harassment in the Toronto School Board for about 20 years as well.
Okay. That's good. Before I go any further, why don't we get into this, because the term queer liberation comes up a lot in the questions you saw that, and we're very flexible here, so we'll have our discussion around how it's problematic to you, and let's start with that.
I wouldn't say problematic, I think it's kind of schizophrenic, right? Because the term queer comes from this postmodern notion of disrupting normalization and all of that kind of work, queer theory, the Foucault stream, that kind of talk. Whereas liberation comes out of that older modernist notion of change. And so when you put them both together, they have a kind of conflict, because on the one hand, if the liberation is the dominant thing, then what it's doing is posing queer as simply an umbrella group or another segment of a broader LGBT community, which is, I think, quite antithetical to the notion of queer, which is to break identity groups, right? Anti-identitarian, attempting to constantly queer those kinds of things, or critique them, or undermine them, or deconstruct them. And if the emphasis is on the queer, it becomes a kind of a verb. So what you're doing is queering liberation, then you'd be undermining or critiquing the notion that liberation is possible. So it seems to me odd to take one term from the modernist vocabulary, liberation, and another term from the anti-modernist vocabulary, and stick them together, and one can't quite figure out how they're supposed to actually work without one subverting the other.
Okay, so this is an example where I'm going to go off script.
Okay.
Go with you on this.
Yeah.
That's an interesting take, and we really welcome a critique of stuff as well. So, so maybe just to clarify, because we've had major discussions within Queer Ontario on this, because it came right from our name to what do we stand for, what is our philosophical perspective, blah, blah, blah. So, and in fact, we, not all of us entirely, so I'm sure you understand that, but we actually have issues and trouble with queer theory.
As do I.
Yeah, okay, and that's many people too. So, and yeah, some of our members say, well, they don't want to discard it completely. They think there's some relevant points to it that's worth keeping, so that's okay too. But the term queer for a lot of us is admittedly umbrella to the point that we even include trans populations, whereas some people in the trans communities are questioning whether that's even appropriate. So that's also a controversy. But there's the umbrella aspect of it, but there's also the political aspect of it. And that's really more where we're coming from, where, you know, it's taking back a term that was once derogatory on the one hand, all the way through to be queer is to celebrate one's diversity. Not, almost to the point where some people are saying, well, in fact, we did an interview choose.
Yeah, there seems to be, I mean, that's one of the problems with the term queer, is that there's very different takes on it. And on the one hand, it produces these internal contradictions, on the other hand, it may be its strength, because it does mean different things to different people, and so they can put blinders on those and then continue working together and not noticing those differences. But I mean, there's the idea of queer as an umbrella term to try to get away from that abysmal series of LGBT, that just keeps expanding and expanding, and to say, okay, we'll call it queer, right? That's kind of one notion. So the queer becomes the identity. And then there's the kind of more political notion that it's an identity that people who are dissatisfied with the kind of homonormative narratives that have been taken up by broad stream LGBT liberation or movements use to distinguish themselves and to say that they're a bit more edgy, or that they're more interested in broader social issues, or that they're disaffected with this notion of normalization. And then there's the actual queer as it emerged from queer theory, which I would say actually disputes both of those kinds of positionings, because it is an anti-identitarian thing. It says, like, we don't identify as anything, right? And that the whole purpose of queer theory is to undermine all identities. And so then, of course, you're left with, well, so what do you do politically, right? How do you organize? Who do you organize for? What's your point? And I think that the real weakness of queer theory is that it doesn't have much of a point, except perhaps to provide a niche of academic jobs for people who can no longer fit within lesbian and gay studies, because those positions were taken up by relatively young people 20 years ago, and they're not ready to retire yet, right? So it produces, it has its social function in terms of employment in the academic world, but other than, I think, a useful critique of some of the blind spots of modernism, this notion of eternal progress, that everything is always, it gets better, that kind of notion, and that recognizes that we're not on this trajectory. Like, I come from a school, I can remember people saying for years, that the gains of the 1917 revolution will never be gone back on. Well, like, duh, yeah, I mean, sorry, history doesn't progress in a particular line towards a particular kind of point that we're all going to get to sooner or later, because there's real problems with that kind of theory, because one can lead to the very opposite of what it's supposed to lead to, which is a kind of okay, then why should I bother working at it if we're going to end up there anyway, right? I mean, just let history take its course. Socialism, liberation will take place. So there's a real tension, I think, in the way this term gets used, right? From the people who invented it and deploy it in academic circles, to the people who try to use it on the ground to show discontent with the strategic decisions made by a more normative gay movement, a lesbian and gay movement, and those people who simply use it as an umbrella term to try to escape long lists of acronyms and letters that are very hard to remember.
I know where we come from in this work, even though we're partly wearing an academic hat and partly wearing an activist hat, but it was very much from a critique of queer theory. So, for example, when I was hiring for our research assistant more so for the research assistant, all kinds of people came forward in the covering letters, and then when we shortlisted right down the interviews, citing and referring to queer theory, despite us being very clear in our job ad that we were talking about queer liberation. And I realize even that term is borrowing from history and yet fairly new, and I recognize queer theory itself, but people just went to that, and we had spent time in the interview.
It's an unstable term, right? And if you're trying to look for a research assistant among undergraduates, this is the world. When they hear the word queer, it triggers queer theory talk, right? If you were hiring people for a seniors program like mine, it would have, the word liberation in that duality would have probably triggered old gay liberation talk, and you wouldn't have had any problem with that. and the queer stuff would have been seen as just, you know, a new acronym or a new term to use for people. So I think that has to do with the selection process of the kind of people you'd be looking at.
Right.
And that's why they would end up, because I think on some level they know that queer and liberation don't really go together, right? Given what queer means in the academic world. Right.
And so what I wanted to clarify on that was that the thrust of this, and this is why the byline to this study is called Resurrection and Development. It's resurrecting the principles and tenets of the gay liberation movement and developing it to see if it fits and works within our movement today, in 2011, and that being, again, this taking up of the term queer, but not necessarily from a queer theory perspective, not necessarily from an academic perspective, but
So you're trying to
the on-the-ground political, where people have begun, whether people like it or not, people really have begun using gay identity politics of identifying as queer as a politicized term, as opposed to the mainstreaming gay kind of neoliberal approach. So that's really where we were coming from.
Yeah.
Now, having explained that, I want to just kind of bring it back to you in terms of, is there a terminology you would prefer as we move forward with this interview?
I think we're at a point in history where we don't have a proper terminology. I think that's why you end up grafting these two things together that are really kind of unstable. So, I mean, I'm quite willing to use that term as long as we know that if you really look at it carefully, it doesn't really hold together. It doesn't make sense. Because one side or the other has to end up winning out. You know, if it's queer liberation and we're just using queer as another identity group, well, then that's fine. But we're back into the old modernist liberation talk, right? And that's cool. I mean, that's the school, that's the world that I came from, right? But I could see how people who are trying to push forward a queer understanding of what's going on in the world would take umbrage with that kind of grafting together, because you know, liberation assumes the repressive hypothesis, for example, right? This is right. You're already going right up Foucault's nose, right? Because you're liberating somebody from something, right? Whereas Foucault kind of tried to dismiss the repressive hypothesis 30 years ago, right? And say, no, it's actually the production of identities that is taking place, not the repression of identities. So, you know, it's unstable, and given that the world itself is relatively unstable, I have no problem banding it about and trying to figure out some sort of a meaning that takes into account the fact that the terms we have don't really work very well.
Do you feel that maybe going forward, the whole liberation movement, whether you call it queer, whether you call it gay or lesbian or whatever, molds itself? Because the reality is that we exist how we exist, and we try, many people try different things to try and get our group, our community, to be who it is, what it is, irregardless of what people try to call it, irregardless of how people try and theorize what is happening. The fact is that it happens. It molds itself. It progresses through time, and we exist in it, and we try to make everything better. So whether or not you look at it from an academic point and say that we have to follow this, nobody follows anything. We make it for ourselves, and we push government issues to sort of make things better for us, make things more equal. Do you think that plays a part in anything like this?
Well, when you talk like that, what you're doing is engaging in that modernist discourse. When you talk about we have to engage governments to make things better, then you're making yourself part of a particular kind of narrative, the kind of narrative that I grew up with, so I'm quite comfortable with that, right? However, when you take it upon yourself to lobby governments to make things better for us, what you're actually doing is trying to make us normal, right? So you're no longer in the queer talk anymore, right? What you're trying to do is to achieve that equality or even equity, right? And so that we're just considered like everybody else, normal folk, and that really cuts against what queer is supposed to be about, which is to say that we're not striving for normalcy at all. We're wanting to keep ourselves distinct and apart, right? But then even when you do that, once again, in another area of instability, keep ourselves distinct and apart, then you're talking about a particular kind of identity, right? So it's what I mean in these terms are unstable is that when you really kind of look at any of them and follow them to their logical conclusion, you don't find a logical conclusion, you just find this kind of mess of contradictions, right? And, you know, personally I think it's a worthwhile exercise to try to make people's lives better, right? Now, then of course you get into the what's better situation. I can remember having fights with people in Spain who said under Franco it was much better for gays because it was a very, you know, there was all the repression meant that we were a very tight group and people really had solidarity and then you really knew who your community was. And once we'd fought and gotten rid of all that fascist repression, you know, it doesn't mean anything anymore. So I like to go back to Franco. Now, this was also somebody who was relatively, from a relatively privileged strata, right? So you get the whole question of how intersectionality feeds into all of these kinds of questions. But what the whole question of what better is, in the modernist notion, you know, the idea of either liberalism or Marxism, both part of those modernist narratives, there is a better. Things, you know, better is not questioned, right? Better is defined in a certain kind of way. More freedom, more this, more that, more consumption, right? More control, more power. You know, so it's more, usually more of something. Whereas postmodern stuff, queer stuff, really undermines that notion of better. And so then you get into things like Massad's book, right, on Desiring Arabs, right, where he goes after this whole notion about, he sees this international liberation work or rights work, human rights work, as being colonial because it's undermining the existing sexual identities in the Arab world and imposing colonial notions of identity around sexual orientation that had developed in the West, right? And so here, once again, like what's better, right? He seems to be arguing that it would be better if there were no human rights accorded to gay people because that simply produces gay people and they've been doing quite well without an idea of gay identity in the Arab world for a millennium, right? So how do you begin to deal with those kinds of issues? Right? So that's an unstable term for an unstable time.
Yeah, yeah, and we are in very complicated times. We're looking at things from multiple levels, and I think that's what you're sharing here. Just to help in terms of stabilizing this, when you were saying before, you know, coming from, one perspective versus another, we just to help clarify, we do come from that first perspective you talked about, where we actually do value identity, and that's where using the term queer as a politicized identity helps in our liberation work. That's in essence where we're coming from when we use this term. And so to some extent we have rejected queer theory. Not entirely, I have to say that, but so that just to help clarify. And even I agree on even that it's not that stable.
No.
So given that, and I think that was very good, by the way, I think we were able to do that. Is it okay if we carry on with the questions using queer liberation?
Go for it.
Okay, so can you share with us then your experiences with all you identify as an activist and social justice work that you've done, that you've had, that you think is significant for how we think about queer liberation as theory or practice?
I guess different struggles and different historical periods had produced different kinds of understandings, right? I mean, we're talking about a trajectory that now spans 30, almost 40 years. So in those early days, I mean the very early days when I came out in '74, it was just the tail end of the gay liberation epoch, before the gay rights epoch kind of moved in. And so sexual liberation was seen as somehow central and crucial to producing a whole new kind of world, and I think that many of us would have said sexual liberation was central to the undermining of capitalism as we knew it. That kind of theory didn't produce much of a social base. It was, good to get stoned and talk about at parties, but didn't move much on the ground. And so what actually did produce a social base, and I think what you were talking about before about how history happens, right? And I guess I would phrase it slightly differently as in terms of the masses make history. That what people coalesced around was not losing their jobs, not getting turfed out of restaurants or refused apartments or whatever because of their sexual orientation. So the kind of that axiomatic personal step of coming out of the closet, which has its own problems because it assumes that the same person is inside and outside the closet, and I think we understand more that is in fact a leap into constructing a whole different kind of person and identity. But what were the material conditions necessary in order to allow people to come out of the closet? Well, that was to remove those kinds of discrimination. Therefore, what we had to do was to look for anti-discrimination protection, and the place you looked for that was from the state. And the notion was that if you got the state to apply that, that would encourage more people to come out, and if more people came out, then that would begin to change the actual social relations around ordinary people's perception. I think that approach proved generally workable. I mean, I think if you look at the trajectory that's taken place over those last 40 years, you've seen that that was quite useful. So that we removed all of those kinds of discriminations, all of those impediments to the full citizenship of people around this notion of sexual identity, right, or sexual orientation. It shifted then, I think. I mean, we talk about that as a kind of a proactive strategy, but in fact, when you look at our history, I think we've made the major gains in terms of reactive kinds of politics. That it was the attempt to shut down the body politic that through this relatively obscure little magazine that nobody outside of a small circle in the gay community, the lesbian and gay communities had ever heard of, into a public limelight and we're on questions of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, that made that issue much more of a common and garden issue for people in the country. Right? It was the attempt to close down the baths with the bath raids that propelled an understanding of and a recognition of the existence of a gay community or lesbian and gay community in the early 80s. It was the event of AIDS and the decimation that AIDS was causing in our community that actually promoted the inclusion of sexual orientation in the Ontario Human Rights Code in '86. Right? That wouldn't have happened without AIDS. So I think at each of these different conjunctures we've learned different things about the state, about our ability to organize, about how identities work. Much of that is invisible when you're doing it. It only becomes visible afterwards when people begin to analyze what in the world happened. I mean, in talking about those reactive things, I mean, the iconic moment in gay liberation history, Stonewall, I mean, it wouldn't have happened if the police hadn't raided the bar, right? It was all about, it was a reaction to something. It wasn't like those queens decided they were going to get together and figure out how they were going to start a gay liberation movement. It was like the police were in the damn faces again, right? And it was a response to that. So I think our movement has really grown and matured through the fights that have been imposed upon us. And Mao said, it's not a bad thing to be attacked by your enemies, right? I think that's how movements figure out who they are and toughen up themselves and develop notions of strategy and tactics that can get them through particular crises, and that produces different kinds of identities and different kinds of constellations and relations of power that then leads to different kinds of stages. So what we've learned, in a very practical way, what we learned about the importance of free speech, that kind of classic liberal notion of free speech, which came up against the constraints of a much more conservative and patriarchal culture, because liberalism is still a relatively new philosophy. It still continues to undermine pre-existing cultural notions of family and tribe and gender and all of those kinds of things. What liberalism does is it removes all of those kinds of connections and talks about the individual. And that was kind of the grounding of, why we shouldn't have to put up with police harassment, right? Because we're rights-bearing individuals like anybody else. Whereas before we were a criminal class, right? Which is, quite a different kind of identity. We could not expect that the police would not raid us. That's what they were supposed to do, because that's who we were. Just like somebody who robs a bank could only expect the police to chase them, right? So that movement, I think that liberal movement at the beginning of gay liberation, that notion of individual rights was enormously important. That expanded into our rights not simply to not be harassed, but to be able to voice our concerns and speak in public around freedom of the press. The 81 bath raids talked about a right to sexuality, and sexuality that was quite different from prescribed notions of sexuality that come from that older culture of tribe and family and nation and all of those kinds of things. Once again, based on that liberal kind of notion that you want to go and fucking baths, it's your own business, you can do that. Right? But when we were doing that, we learned a whole lot about how the law works and how the law was in fact in contradiction to those notions of liberalism that were that were undermining all of those old kinds of social relations. AIDS produced a whole different kind of learning, because then suddenly we found ourselves not dealing with law and the courts or that aspect of the state, but how medicine worked, right? Connected to the state in many ways, organized and orchestrated by the state in many ways, but on other ways a kind of an independent realm with its own kind of dynamics, its own kind of power relations, and the notion of doctor-patient or researcher-subject suddenly were thrown into the foreground. We had to figure out, what does it mean when gay people are in the doctor-patient relationship, and what does it mean when we're in the subject-researcher relationship, right? Because suddenly our bodies were very important for a huge amount of stuff that was going on, and what did our identity mean around that kind of thing? And I guess the kind of more recent struggles around QuaIA, which actually take on queer in much the same way I think that Queer Ontario does, is this kind of, or more than just contrarian notion of what it means to be, or what it could mean for us as people who don't fit in those kinds of normative relationships at a point when many of us do fit in those kinds of normative relationships. Here I think we find ourselves struggling with, theoretically, with what this means to be queer or gay or lesbian in a globalized world. A globalized world where people are being this kind of subject position is being called forth or is spreading into cultural traditions that are quite different from the one that gave birth to it here. And do we simply fall into some of the real weaknesses of that old modernist perspective that saw the West as the most developed and other places as underdeveloped, and it was simply a matter of them catching up, and we have to help them by either invading them or stealing everything they have or all of that kind of stuff, right? And you still see that kind of thing in terms of some of the gay human rights work that takes place. How do you reconcile that with a notion of queerness that says you're supposed to look at the relative, the kind of cultural relativism in terms of different cultures may have very different trajectories and maybe moving in different directions. How do you posit a gay subject position or a queer subject position in a society that does not embrace liberal values of individuality? Because you need that in order for me to say, well, I don't want to get married, I want to do something different. It means that I cut myself off, or I break the expectations of family and of tribe and of culture and of religion, all of those kinds of things, right? And based on the notion that I am an individual and have the right to do so. So if you're talking about parts of the world that haven't raised that notion of individuality on a pedestal the way that liberal capitalism has, how does that fit? Are you in fact becoming part of a colonial penetration of those societies? And if you take that line, which is Massad's line, then you also run the risk of seeing those societies as unchanging and having no trajectory, simply caught in a particular kind of worldview that isn't evolving in the same way. And I don't think we've figured out we certainly haven't figured out how that's done yet. And you can see in the kind of our reaction in certain parts of Africa, for example, now, where tradition is being mobilized as an anti-homosexual force, right? Uganda, I think, is the prime example, where traditional Africans don't believe in homosexuality, and therefore this is seen as this colonial penetration. Oddly enough, though, mostly organized within the colonial penetration of Christian churches in Uganda, right? So that you have these churches, which are the kind of iconic example of colonial penetration, using tradition to struggle to try to crush what they see as another form of colonial penetration, right? And what does that mean for Africans, right? For queer Africans, or for Africans who then adopt the identity of, say, I'm gay or I'm lesbian, right? What does it mean for them to do that in that context? You've seen that kind of struggle in North America, for example, where among Aboriginal people they shifted the discourse to the notion of two-spirited, right? To try to once again find a tradition around which they can base their kind of, it's not actually a coming out, but it's emergence, I guess. And so many Africans are doing that kind of work too, to look for that, but then that kind of harkening back to imaginary pasts and imaginary traditions that in fact you're constructing and creating all the time, right? Has its own set of problematics. The fact that particular initiation ceremonies might have involved same-sex sex. What does that mean? What does that have to do with gay identity today? Right? Why should we need to unearth those kinds of things to justify this? There's a whole critique of that kind of thing as well.
Very complicated stuff.
Very fucking complicated.
Yeah. This is just more common. We'll come back to the question. question, but it just speaks to how difficult the work is depending on what realm you're in.
Yeah.
And you kind of hit the realms from, you know, an individualistic, liberalized approach versus the rights movement versus, you know, if you get into the more international or transnational perspective, how that shapes everything up even more. And it's, yes,
And one of the reasons, I guess, that I've stuck with QuaIA is that, you know, it forces you, you're in this mess, right? It forces you to try to figure out how to do this kind of politics, because it's not easy, right? It's not like it's very clear how you're supposed to proceed in this. I mean, there's a classic example where it's Israel, which is, you know, this liberal, not to say the neoliberal state in the midst of, you know, colonial state in the midst of the Middle East, which because of that has this notion of individual rights and therefore a gay rights movement, but at the same time as it's engaging in colonial activities, which is disenfranchising, you know, millions of indigenous people, right? So how do you play that, right? Because on the one hand, though many of those kind of indigenous cultures surrounding have used homophobia as a means of attacking Israel, right? I mean, Israel's this degenerate, you know, Western state that is contrary to Islamic values, right? But at the same time, you've got to be in solidarity with people who are being displaced from their homes and their livelihoods and from their kind of social conditions, and try to figure out